what we're going to do today is look at sites that show how Bloomington, Illinois is a place that grew politically and influenced Lincoln in a way that few communities in Illinois did so. Certainly Springfield, but second to Springfield, Bloomington had more involvement with Lincoln. He spent more time here than he did in almost any other place in the state. He also was a guy who was learned, and we're going to talk about how he learned, and we're going to talk about how he learned from people here, because that's part of any person's development, and it's a very special piece about Lincoln. We're going to relate this, when we can, to standing buildings where Lincoln was in and out of. One of the things that Bloomington has is, I think, we figure more standing sites associated with Lincoln than Springfield. So there's some really interesting things here to look at and to talk about. Lincoln was an attorney, as you know. He practiced on what was called the Eighth Circuit. And what that meant was lawyers and the judge would ride from county seat to county seat. And that changed over time, but McLean County was always in that circuit. And in that work, attorneys would spend a session in the spring and a session in the fall at each county seat. And Lincoln was at every session of McLean County Circuit Court, save some time when he was in Springfield, in Washington, D.C., from 1837 through 1860. So he was here a lot. He knew a lot of people, and he did a lot of law for people in this community. So he was known as a lawyer. And so part of the thing that we'll be talking about is that. His work as a lawyer went from very simple cases to very complex cases, and we'll also talk a bit about that. And unfortunately, this bus is blocking our view, so we're going to go down here to our first site. And I'll be talking about what's behind me. So if you want to gather in, feel free to get up on the mulch there. You're not going to hurt anything. Those wood shavings don't have any feelings. Okay, what we're looking at, if you look at the building called Burpo's Boutique, it's part of a building called the Phoenix Block that was built in 1856. On the upper floor, and we don't know which upper floor, a pretty interesting meeting took place. It was in 1858, after Lincoln lost the senatorial contest to Stephen A. Douglas for Senator of Illinois. Lincoln won the popular vote, but because there was voting not directly for Senate, but rather the Illinois Senate voted for who got to be the U.S. Senator, Lincoln lost that vote. And his debates became very well known, not just today, but then, when Douglas and Lincoln debated the issues of the day, the United States, people of the United States started following that discussion because they were talking about very core ideas and very core issues that were taking place. And we'll talk about some of that a little later. But it was in November, after the election, that Jesse Fell was walking down Washington Street and coming this direction, and the courthouse, sitting pretty much where this one is. It was a two-story brick courthouse. He saw Lincoln come out of the door, the south door, and he goes to him and says, "Mr. Lincoln," he says, "I've been out east, and people have been talking about these debates, and you have defined what is this new Republican Party movement. You have defined something that is galvanizing the nation, and the people out east want to know, who is this Lincoln? Who is this man? We don't know anything about him." So he says, "I want to talk to you." And so he takes Lincoln up those stairs, up into the upper floor, again we don't know which one, over the Burpo's Boutique, and sits him down and he says, "Because of what I've been talking to you about, I think that what we need to do is calculate how we can get you to agree to run for the presidency. Fell, at this point in time, is the secretary to the Illinois Republican Party. And what that means is he's essentially the chief communicator and one of their prime political operatives. So he's a politician. He's a political organizer. And so when he's talking this, he's talking from a very focused viewpoint about what it is to win elections and what all this business is about. And he talks to Lincoln more about this idea. And Lincoln says, look, he says, as Judge Davis would say, I don't think it'll pay. Now, what he meant by that was not the money wasn't there, but rather, I don't think it's going to work. And so Fell said to him, look, why don't you go home and think about it, talk to people down there, and if you decide you want to do this, and I think you should, I want you to write a brief autobiography for me. And I'm going to have that autobiography published in newspapers all through the East Coast, particularly Pennsylvania, particularly there, because we can do some real good there. And Lincoln said, okay, I'll think about it. And he did, for about a year. And in 1859, he sends a brief 6-page autobiography to Fell with a cover letter. And in the cover letter he says, well, there's not so much of this because there's not so much of me, explaining its brevity. And if, by the way, if you want to read it, we have a copy of it on exhibit in our Lincoln Gallery here at the museum. But in that autobiography, he does something that's really kind of different, not only because of its brevity. He says, I'm a guy who's poor. And if you want to understand my life, you simply have to understand a life of poverty. I don't come from anybody. There weren't any Lincolns that really made any difference. They weren't anybody of any renown, any importance, or any connection. Now, in a time of history, in a community like Illinois, and in a politics like the Old Northwest, politics of because this was the West, that statement was a pretty interesting statement because politics were based on personal reputation, and personal reputations were based on family. So if your family was a good family, pretty good likelihood you would be considered a good person. And Lincoln throws that away. So I don't have that. And he says, I had some education. I could cipher to the rule of 3. I could read, write, and cipher to the rule of 3. Now on that one, he kind of fudged a bit. Lincoln was actually a pretty decent mathematician. He was doing math at that period that would be like today's introductory calculus. Okay, so he kind of fudged, you know. Sometimes I like to think that Lincoln invented the concept of the humble country lawyer, okay, because that's what he was projecting. Now, then he does something quite interesting. He says, I was born in a log cabin. Now, that's true, but when he says that, he's speaking on another level, because the log cabin is the symbol of the Whig Party, which was a party that was in collapse. He had been a member of the Whig Party, and by saying that, he is symbolically putting his hand out to those people who used to be Whigs, to say, I'm one of you. I'm a Western Whig. It's very important for him to say that. And then he ends up with a statement that to me is startling. He gives a personal description of himself. He says, I'm about 6'4", I have dark, coarse hair, and no other brands or marks recollected. No other brands or marks recollected was used in stray animal notices and in runaway slave notices. So what's Lincoln doing? He's describing himself, his body. He is embodying the body of a slave. He's describing himself as a slave is described. He is making common identity with slavery, with slaves. He's making a really subtle but important statement, and people would have heard that. They would have understood what he was doing. So what we're going to have to figure out is, how does Lincoln, born in Kentucky, raised in Indiana, come to manhood in Illinois, on the essentially a southern frontier, how does he become such an eloquent spokesperson for this issue that tore the United States in two? And so to start that story, we're going to go up to the Miller Davis building at the corner of Front and Main, and we're going to talk there, because it's a building built in 1843, and Lincoln was there. We'll talk more then.